You're crouched in a drainage ditch outside a village you can't pronounce, somewhere in the grasslands south of Kursk, and you can hear it before you see it. The sound comes through the earth first. A low, mechanized growl that vibrates through your boots, through your chest, through the wooden stock of the rifle you're gripping so hard your knuckles have gone white. Then the dust rises over the ridgeline. Then the shape materializes. Sloped armor, long gun, black crosses painted over Dunkelgelb camouflage that looks gold in the morning sun. A panther, and you're holding a bottle full of gasoline. This is the story of how the Red Army turned desperation into doctrine, how Soviet infantry learned to kill the most advanced medium tank in the world with weapons they made in basements and brewery floors, and how a tactic born from necessity at the Battle of Kursk became one of the most psychologically devastating close combat methods of the Second World War. July 1943. The Eastern Front has become a vast, churning engine of industrial murder. 2.5 million men, 7,000 tanks, 5,000 aircraft, and 34,000 artillery pieces are about to collide in an area of steppe and farmland smaller than the state of Connecticut. Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive in the East, is designed to pinch off the Kursk salient, encircle Soviet forces, and restore momentum to a Wehrmacht that hasn't won a strategic victory since the fall of Sevastopol 13 months earlier. For the attack, Germany has concentrated the best divisions it still possesses: SS Panzer Corps, Grossdeutschland Division, and a new generation of armor, the Panther AUSFD, rushed into production after the shock of encountering Soviet T-34s in 1941 and 1942. The Panther is supposed to be the answer. 75mm high-velocity gun, sloped frontal armor up to 80mm thick, speed, range, optics superior to anything the Soviets field in large numbers. On paper, it's the most lethal medium tank on Earth. But there's a problem. The Panther has been in production for less than 4 months. Reliability is a nightmare. Engines catch fire, transmissions seize, final drives shatter under the tank's own weight. At Kursk, entire Panther battalions are rendered combat ineffective, not by Soviet guns, but by mechanical failure, and the ones that do make it to the front line are about to encounter something German tank crews were not psychologically prepared for: Soviet soldiers willing to get close enough to touch them. The Molotov cocktail is not a Soviet invention. It's named mockingly after Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister who, during the Winter War with Finland in 1939, claimed that Soviet bombers were dropping food, not bombs, on Finnish civilians. The Finns, surrounded and outgunned, responded by creating improvised incendiary devices and calling them Molotov cocktails, a drink to go with his meals. They used them to destroy over 200 Soviet tanks in conditions so cold that gasoline wouldn't always ignite. The Red Army learned the lesson. By 1941, as German panzers tore through Soviet defenses and encircled entire armies, Soviet infantry units were already being issued instructions for creating and deploying what they called zajigatelnie butilki, incendiary bottles. Early versions were crude: beer bottles or vodka bottles filled with gasoline, kerosene, or a mix of both, with a rag stuffed into the neck. You light the rag. You throw. If the bottle breaks on the engine deck or near the air intakes, the burning liquid floods into the engine compartment. Fuel lines catch fire. Rubber components melt. Crew compartments fill with smoke. If the fire spreads to ammunition or fuel tanks, the result is catastrophic. But by 1943, Soviet production of these weapons has become industrialized. Factories churn out standardized glass bottles, half-liter or liter capacity, pre-filled with thickened fuel mixtures. Some contain white phosphorus, which ignites on contact with air. Others use a sulfuric acid igniter, a small glass ampule strapped to the side of the bottle that shatters on impact, igniting the contents without needing a rag or lighter. Millions of these bottles are distributed to Red Army infantry, tank hunter units, and partisan groups. Instructions are printed in field manuals. Training is conducted behind the lines. The tactic is simple in theory. Get close, stay low, wait for the tank to pass or stop. Hit the rear deck, the engine grills, or the air vents. If you're brave enough or desperate enough, climb onto the tank itself. In practice, it requires a kind of courage that most human beings do not possess. You need to understand what it feels like to be told you're going to fight a panther with a bottle. You're an infantryman in a rifle division, maybe a guardsman if your unit earned that designation after surviving Stalingrad or Rjev. You've been in combat long enough to know the sound every German vehicle makes. You know the howl of a Stuka, the rattle of an MG-42, the crack of an 88. You know what it looks like when a T-34 brews up, the way the turret lifts off the hull like a lid on a boiling pot. And now you've been given 2 glass bottles, a pouch of grenades, and orders to stop a tank that weighs 45 tons and can kill you from a kilometer away. The tactical briefings are blunt. Soviet doctrine by 1943 doesn't sugarcoat. You're told that the Panther's frontal armor cannot be penetrated by your anti-tank rifles. You're told that even the 76.2 Mitrus guns on the T-34s are struggling at range. You're told that the only reliable way to kill a Panther with infantry weapons is to get within 10 meters and aim for the weak points. Rear engine deck, side skirts if you can pry them off, vision blocks if you can blind the crew, tracks if you want to immobilize it and call in artillery. Or you burn it. The bottles go in a canvas satchel. They clink when you move, a sound you learn to muffle with cloth. You're part of a tank descent, a small unit of infantry trained to work in close coordination with Soviet armor, riding on the back of T-34s or moving through cover while tanks draw fire. If the T-34s can force the Panthers to button up, to close their hatches and rely on periscopes, they become slower, less aware, vulnerable. That's when you move. 5th of July, 1943. Near Ponyri, northern shoulder of the Kursk salient. German 9th Army launches its attack. The first Panthers cross the start line at dawn, moving through minefields that have been cleared by engineer teams during the night. Soviet defenders have fortified the village and the railway embankment behind it with anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and deeply dug-in positions. The fighting is immediate and vicious. Within hours, several Panthers are already burning, not from Soviet tanks, but from close assault teams. One account, later recorded by a Soviet lieutenant, describes a moment that encapsulates the tactic's brutality. A Panther, separated from its supporting infantry after they're pinned down by mortar fire, advances down a dirt road between 2 wooden houses. A 3-man team moves up along the left side, using a low stone wall for cover. The tank commander, buttoned up, doesn't see them. The Panther stops to traverse its turret toward a suspected anti-tank gun position. One soldier sprints forward. He's close enough to see the welds on the hull, close enough to hear the engine's mechanical whine. He climbs onto the rear deck, his boots slipping on the hot metal. He pulls 2 bottles from his satchel, smashes them against the engine grills, and jumps off as the phosphorus ignites. White flames pour into the engine compartment. Smoke billows from every seam. 30 seconds later, the crew bails out. They're cut down before they reach cover. This is not a story about heroism in the way it's usually told. This is a story about what happens when you force ordinary human beings to fight machines with their hands. The casualty rates for Soviet tank hunter teams at Kursk are staggering. Estimates suggest that infantry units tasked with close assault suffered losses upwards of 60% in the first 3 days of combat. Many died before they could throw their bottles. Machine gun fire from supporting German infantry. Coaxial guns on the Panthers themselves. Shrapnel from high explosive shells. Or simply being crushed under the tracks. But the tactic worked. German after-action reports from Kursk repeatedly mention close combat teams and incendiary attacks. Panther crews, already struggling with mechanical failures and inexperience, many had been assigned to the tanks only weeks before the offensive, now faced an enemy willing to climb onto their vehicles. The psychological effect was immediate. Tank commanders became reluctant to advance without infantry support. When infantry support was unavailable or pinned down, Panthers would halt, reverse, or refuse to enter villages and tree lines where ambush was likely. This is how you break the momentum of an armored offensive, not by destroying every tank, but by making every advance cost time, cohesion, and nerve. Soviet doctrine evolved rapidly during the battle. By the second week of July, as the Germans shifted their focus to the southern shoulder and the village of Prokhorovka, Red Army instructions for Molotov attacks had been refined and disseminated across multiple fronts. The preferred method was no longer the lone soldier sprint. That was suicide. Instead, teams of 4 to 6 men would work together. One man carried the bottles. 2 carried grenades or satchel charges. 1 or 2 provided suppressing fire with rifles or submachine guns. They moved in pairs, covered each other, used smoke and terrain. The best opportunities came during combined arms counterattacks. When Soviet T-34s engaged German armor at close range, sometimes within 200 meters, sometimes closer, German tanks would button up, focus forward, become tunnel-visioned. That's when infantry closed from the flanks or rear. Soviet tanks weren't there to kill Panthers from the front. They were there to create the chaos that let infantry kill them from behind. At Prokhorovka, on the 12th of July, during the largest tank engagement of the battle, Molotov teams were integral to Soviet defensive success. Accounts from participants describe burning Panthers scattered across the steppe, some destroyed by tank fire, others by close assault. The exact numbers are disputed, Soviet claims inflated, German records incomplete, but the impact is undeniable. The SS divisions advancing toward Prokhorovka were stopped. They did not break through, and the offensive died there. But let's not romanticize this. Let's be clear about what it actually meant to do this. You are 19 years old. You grew up in a village that no longer exists. You've been in the Red Army for 14 months. You've seen friends die in ways you can't describe to anyone who wasn't there. And now you're holding a bottle of jellied gasoline, waiting in a ditch while a 45-ton machine rolls toward you, and you're trying to decide if you're fast enough, if your hands will stop shaking, if the bottle will break, if the fire will catch, if you'll even make it 2 steps before the machine gun sees you. And if you succeed, if you burn the tank, you still have to get out. You still have to run, because there are more tanks. There are always more tanks. Some Soviet soldiers refused. Some broke under the psychological strain. Soviet sources acknowledge that penal units, Strafniki, were sometimes assigned these missions, particularly when regular infantry units had already taken heavy casualties. These were men who had been convicted of desertion, cowardice, or minor infractions, given a chance to redeem themselves with blood. Survival rates were even lower, but most of the men who carried Molotovs at Kursk were not penal troops. They were ordinary soldiers, many of them veterans, who understood that this was the only way to stop the offensive. They weren't suicidal. They were calculating. They waited for the right moment. They used the terrain. They worked as teams. And when the moment came, they moved. That kind of discipline, under that kind of pressure, is something most people will never understand. The Panthers' reputation never recovered from Kursk, not fully. After the battle, German tank crews called it the firebug. Improvements were made, engine reliability increased, final drives strengthened, crew training extended. But the psychological damage was done. The myth of invincibility, the idea that superior technology alone could decide battles, shattered in the grasslands south of Kursk. For the Red Army, the Molotov cocktail remained a standard infantry weapon for the rest of the war. It was used in Belorussia in 1944, in the Vistula Oder offensive, in the streets of Berlin. By 1945, German instruction manuals warned tank crews about Soviet bottle throwers and advised never to advance into urban areas without infantry screening. The tactics spread. Resistance movements across occupied Europe adopted it. The Warsaw Uprising in 1944 saw Polish fighters use Molotov cocktails against German armor in nearly identical ways: close ambushes, rear-deck attacks, coordinated infantry armor tactics. The weapon became a symbol of asymmetric warfare, of populations refusing to be crushed by machines. But at Kursk, in July 1943, it was something simpler and more desperate.